Looking for which theory you want is a lot like walking through a car lot and trying to figure out what kind of car you'd like to buy. First, let's look at occupation-based models, or what we will sometimes refer to as OBM. The first one we're going to look at is the Canadian Model of Occupational Performance, or the CMOP. Let's talk about some of the special features of the CMOP. First of all, the CMOP is client-centered, or the person directs the care. And this means that it follows the 6 principles of the client-centered practices laid out by Rogers. The model is 3D to illustrate the interaction between the person, the occupations, and the environment, and how they're embedded in one another. So even though the model is a static picture, it's designed to be a dynamic interaction, and that's shown by how the different sections of the model are embedded in each other. And notice that the human spirit is the focus of the model. The second model we're going to look at is occupational behavior, and this is the original model that Mary Riley put forward. Now, one thing about Mary Riley is that she was just so smart that it was sometimes hard to understand what it was she was trying to say, and she didn't really have a visual model for her occupation-based model, but she had 10 principles instead, and sometimes people will use the upward spiral to represent the principles of exploration, competency, and achievement that are included in this model. And the model of human occupation then was built on the occupational behavior model, and it has more of a systems theory approach. So let's talk about these two models just a little bit more because they do dovetail on each other. Gary Kielhofner, who designed the MOHO, was a student of Mary Riley, and so that's one of the reasons why they go together so well. He further developed some of the thoughts that she had and put them in what I think is a more understandable format for all of us to be able to understand. So occupational behavior focuses on a person's way to occupy their time, reach achievement, and address the economic realities of life, which we call occupation. And the focus of the occupational behavior model is to prevent and reduce the disruptions and incapacities in occupational behavior. That is what an occupational therapist will then do. And like I said before, Mary Riley had these 10 assumptions. And Gary Kielhofner took those and put them into systems theory, which is a change in one part that impacts the whole. So this comes out of the business world where if you change one thing, other things are going to change in response. And it's called a heterarchy versus a hierarchy. Things don't flow down a chain of command. Rather, they impact each other very organically. And in particular, the MOHO focuses on the internal subsystems of volition, habituation, performance capacity, or what's called mind-brain-body. So that's just a different name for performance capacity. So when you're shopping for theories, if you're looking for the original, you would look for occupational behavior. And if you're looking for something that's much more detailed, especially to explain what's going on with the individual, the MOHO might be your theory. And this is the Ecology of Human Performance model, or EHP. This is the visual diagram. Notice the person is inside of a circle, which is the context. And then coming out of that is a performance range, which encompasses some tasks and leaves other tasks outside of it. Let's talk about the EHP just a little bit more. So the EHP key points, it's all about the environment. This focuses on the complexities of the context in which a person is embedded. It's about the transaction between the environment, the person, and the tasks they want to perform. And basically the definition of ecology is the interrelationships of an organism with the context in which they are placed. So if the model that you're looking for needs to be something that is focused on the environment or that is important to the entire interdisciplinary team, the EHP might be the model for you. This is occupational adaptation, and while I admit the concept map is a little scary to look at, this one is developed by occupational therapists for occupational therapists with specific occupational therapy language. So it is one that was not designed for use with interdisciplinary approaches, but instead focuses on specific concepts to occupational therapy. And what it focuses on are that all people have adaptive capacity. Everybody, no matter how severely disabled, has an adaptive capacity, an ability to change in response to needs of the environment. And all people seek to achieve that relative mastery. And we'll define those terms just a little bit more as the semester goes on. The important thing to remember about the OA is the sub-process of the internal adaptation and the sub-process of the external feedback that comes from the occupational environment. So if you're looking for a model that describes how a person adapts and focuses on that adaptive process, the OA is a good model for you. This is one that resonates with some people, and other people just really don't like it because of the whole concept map. So it just all depends on what clicks with you. This is person, environment, occupation, and unfortunately we're not going to get to this till the end of the semester, and this is one of my favorites because of its simplicity, but yet its intricacies in being able to conceptualize what's going on with a person. So you'll notice it's basically a Venn diagram with three circles, and it's all about how they overlap with each other. And that trajectory is looked at over time. How are the three circles fitting at different points in the person's lifespan? So if you're looking to integrate a lifespan or a development perspective with an occupational behavior approach, this is a good model for that. It also is very transactional, looks at how those three aspects, the person, the occupation, and the environment, transact with each other. And we'll talk a little bit more about interaction versus transaction. Transaction is more complex, where a lot of things are going on simultaneously. The PEO key points, as I said, it's transactional. The parts are constantly impacting each other. And the fit of these transactions changes over a lifespan, and achieving a good fit between the person, environment, and occupation is the focus of the intervention. So if you're looking for a model that is very simple in its visual aspect, but complex in its interactions and lifespan focus, this might be the model for you. The person, environment, occupation, performance model. Some people see this as the same as the PEO model, and the authors of our textbook view them somewhat that way, and that is why I'm not using the textbook for this particular section on the PEO and the PEOP, because they are different models. They have a different visual, and they have a little bit different focus. They do include the same elements of person, environment, and occupation. The PEOP has a little bit more static looking model, but it focuses on occupational performance and participation. This is the updated version, and I'm sorry for the poor picture. This was basically a quick snapshot with my phone. I will try to get some better images for later in the semester. But they have updated the PEOP within the last year, and they've tried to show a little bit more of the dynamic interactions between the person, environment, and occupation by basically making them 3D and overlapping them with each other and adding some color to it. So PEOP key points is all about that end product of occupational engagement and performance. One of the things about the PEOP is that it's specifically designed for use with organizations, communities, and populations, as well as individuals. So if you're looking at a client that is a group rather than an individual for your project, or if you're looking to explain a little bit more about the outcome, the occupational engagement and performance, this might be the approach for you. This is a top-down approach, which means that the PEOP starts with the desired occupations and looks at the person's capacity to achieve those. And finally, the KAWA model for our occupation-based models. This model is made in response to the fact that most of these other, or all of these other models are very Western in their approach. So this was made by a Canadian-Japanese citizen named Iwama, and he developed a model that is somewhat lifespan in its approach because it looks at life as a river. Kawa means river in Japanese. My son confirmed that, the Japanese student in our family. and talks about how the river goes from birth to the end of life. And throughout that process, there are assets and there are obstacles. We all have a certain number of resources, and we have these obstacles that can basically plug up our river. And the goal of occupational therapy is to open up that river and allow life flow to happen. It takes out terms like occupation and productivity, because that's not the focus in different cultures. Okay, so some of the key points of the KAWA model. Again, life flows like a river. Sometimes there's impediments to the flow, but everybody has resources, and the OT role is to remove those impediments and increase life flow. This is a great model to use if, one, you have someone who does not think in our traditional American Western way of doing things that it's all about the productivity and individualism. This model much more emphasizes connectivity to the culture around you, the community around you, the family around you. And two, this is a good model to use when you want to involve the client with the model. It's a very simple model to understand. It's a metaphor that most people are familiar with. So if you want to involve the client in asking, what do you feel like are the impediments in your life? What do you feel are your resources? This is a good model for that. Okay, as we're moving through our car lot, we're now going to come to the frames of reference. First, we have the lifespan or developmental frame of reference, and you got to spend a whole semester on this when you were taking your developmental class. This is considered ages and stages, and it's all about completing normal developmental tasks. And the focus of OT with this model, or this frame of reference, it is a frame of reference, is focusing on assisting the person with transitional tasks, moving them to that next developmental level. Sensory integration focuses on a person's ability to take in sensory information and integrate that information into actions. Jean Ayres originally developed this, especially for children, but it's also used with adult populations now. Applied and cognitive behavioral frames of reference. Applied is your classical conditioning model. You often hear of ABA therapists basically looking at stimulus response or action consequence. Ann Mosey originally in OT called this the acquisitional frame of reference. Little side note, this is what I learned in theory back 100 years ago when I was in OT school, and it talks about acquiring the needed behaviors. It's very concrete focused. Cognitive behavioral says that thinking influences behavior, and that our thoughts can be modified as well, which will change our actions. And it focuses on abilities to manage yourself. Okay, so here are some cognitive frames of reference that we're going to look at. There are so many cognitive frames of reference. We're going to look at only two. One is Toglia's dynamic interactional, and the other is Allen's cognitive disability. And these are very good examples of the types of different cognitive frames of reference that you'll find. The dynamic interactional is focused on making the person better able to complete activities or to complete occupations, but especially starting with activities in smaller chunks. It uses the dynamic systems theory. Notice what that might go well with, maybe the MOHO. And it focuses on changing a person's occupational performance through interacting with particular activity demands. So it's that just right challenge. It's that good fit between the occupation, the activity, and what the person is able to do. And basically controlling those demands and gradually increasing them until the person is able to handle their environment. Cognitive disability, rather, says this is a person who's not going to change. So obviously there are people who cognitively improve and there are people who don't cognitively improve. For example, folks with Alzheimer's disease. So the cognitive disability is a good frame of reference for those folks, because what it does is look at adapting the environment to facilitate occupational performance at the optimal level for a person that has a cognitive disability. And its evaluation assesses the rank, kind of ranks the person's level of cognitive disability. Biomechanical and rehabilitative, you're actually going to spend several semesters with the biomechanical and rehabilitative approach. For our purposes, we're counting them as one, because what they both do is look at applying the principles of physics to human movement and posture with respect to the forces of gravity. Biomechanical especially looks at a person's capacity for motion, and the rehabilitative looks at how a person adapts or compensates, or what environmental modifications we can make when a remediation of those deficits is not possible. Psychodynamic is all about the intrapersonal aspects of the person, or how the person relates to him or herself. These are interpersonal relationships and how the person, these also include interpersonal relationships and how the person relates to activity or occupation to express theirself and interact with the world. And we'll be spending more time on that later on in this semester, but it's all the id, ego, superego that you learn back in your psych classes. Motor control and motor learning. These are two broad ways of looking at a person's ability to neurologically perform the tasks that they're able to do. So these come out of neuroscience, and of course you've spent a whole semester doing that, working on the neuroscience aspect. So these take the principles of neuroscience and move into how do we help people get better who have neurological deficits. Motor control is a bundle of the early theories, and we'll talk about who developed some of those later on in the semester, but they focus on reflexes and hierarchical control of movement, and they use brain plasticity to do that. Now, motor learning also uses brain plasticity, but it says that what we learned earlier is not the way things happen, and we need a task-oriented approach. The motor learning theorists say that solutions for movement emerge from the interaction of the person with their environment. So basically, you just need to provide them a lot of opportunities for movement in a lot of different contexts. And it uses a hierarchical approach that the person is constantly interacting with their environment, and the motor learning changes how the person adapts to each different situation. And we'll spend more time talking about that later in the semester as well. There are many other frames of reference. I've kind of mentioned it or alluded to a few along the way. One is the intentional relationship model that you learned about in your therapeutic skills class. That is a model that's open for use. There are many branches of biomechanical, motor learning theories. A new one that I've just recently learned about is called a participative occupational justice. Say that 3 times fast. Frame of reference. I'm not that familiar with it, but if you want to explore it, be my guest. I would say that if you choose a frame of reference for your project that is different from one of the ones that we have listed here, that you get with me, and we'll just touch base and make sure that that's going to work for you. But there are new frames of references being developed all the time. I do hope that this short car lot tour of the occupation-based models and frames of reference were helpful to you in determining what you might use for your project. It's meant to be just a brief survey of what's out there and what we're going to be covering this semester, and we'll spend more time on each of them as the weeks progress. Thanks for listening.